I hope you are doing well. You have understood the early parts of the components of the lecture today. Let's move on. Now we want to know the details of the components of gross domestic product. Technically, gross domestic product consists of the four important components. The first component is consumption, or in Malay we call it penggunaan. And the second component is investment. And then the third component is government purchases, perbelanjaan kerajaan. And the final component is the net export. If you notice, the GDP as shown on this slide has four components. What is it telling you? It simply tells you that this particular economy is operating as an open economy, or in Malay we call it ekonomi terbuka. How do we know it is an open economy? Because of the import-export activities component included, the NX component. So mathematically, these GDP components can be put together to form this mathematical function. Here indicates the GDP, the income generated by a country through its economic activities. And the C make up one of the component, the I make up one of the component, and the G as well as the export sector. Let us look at net export. Net export is simply telling us that what is the difference between the value of goods and services we export, minus the value of goods and services we import. That's why we get the net export. Net export in Malay is called export bersih. We minus import from the values of our export. So what is consumption exactly? Consumption refers to the spending made by household on goods and services, with the exception of purchases of new housing. Why purchases of new housing? Normally, a new house will take time to be completed. You may do the purchase of the house this year, but you don't consume the house immediately after you purchase, because it will take time for you to be able to move into the house, stay in the house, and enjoy the house. And the second component, investment, it simply refers to the spending on capital equipment, inventories and structures, including new housing. If you were to look in the case of a firm, a factory of a firm, when they establish, they need the building. Inside the building, they need equipment. And these are all taken into account as investment component of the GDP. Meanwhile, the government purchases component includes the spending made by the government on goods and services. And the spending can be made either by the local government, or in Malay we call it kerajaan tempatan, state government, or the federal government. But it does not include unproductive expenditure. For example, transfer payment. Yeah, because they are not made in exchange for product and services. I give you the simplest example, closest to you. Transfer payment, for example, PTN, the student study loan. The government spend on you, but you don't produce goods and services at the particular time when you receive the payment. Or you get a scholarship from the government. For example, in 2020, you get a scholarship, bantuan khas, special payment from the government, but you don't produce any kind of goods and services in the year 2020. So this kind of expenditure made by the government will not be counted as part of the GDP under government purchases. The net export, as I mentioned earlier, basically refers to the difference between the value of a country's exports minus the value of the country's import. So net export can be a positive value, can be a negative value, or can be zero. If export is greater than import, the net export value will be positive. If the value of imports is larger than the value of exports, then the net export value is negative. If the value of export of a country is similar to the value of the imports of a country, then the value of net exports is zero. Now we look at another concept which is also important in our understanding of gross domestic product or national income. In economics, it's important for you to also understand the nominal concept and the real concept. In a very simple term, the nominal concept is when the value of GDP is measured during the current year market value. So, if you are measuring GDP for 2019, so the values of the GDP for 2019 is said to be measured at a nominal level. So the value is only true for that particular 2019 based on that year's market value. Real GDP is different from nominal GDP because you have to compare the actual value of the GDP by comparing it to the value of the base year. Yeah? So nominal is the current. When you compare the current GDP with the base year GDP, you get the real GDP. So in terms of its conceptual meaning, nominal GDP is sum of total economic output produced in a year valued at the current market price. Ya, current market price, iaitu harga pasaran semasa. It does not take into the value of the market in the year in the past. In the past years. So real GDP is a sum total of economic output produced in a year valued at a predetermined base market price. So we want to compare the current year, let's say 2019 GDP, we want to compare it with a base year, let's say 2010. So how different is the value of the GDP in 2019 as compared to the value related to 2010? So we would expect nominal values and real GDP values are going to be different. Because this one is current year, this one is compared to the base year that we refer to, a base year here in this context. We also take into consideration of inflation, when we count GDP. But when we count nominal GDP, we don't take into account the element of inflation. That's why it's called real, because in reality inflation has to be adjusted. So when we count real and nominal GDP, real include inflation, nominal does not include inflation. So the GDP in 2019 is nominal, as in the 2019. We don't take into account the effect of inflation. But when we consider inflation, to see what is the actual value of the GDP, then we are already considering the concept of real GDP. Nominal GDP is expressed in the current market price. This one is expressed in the base year, I already mentioned earlier. And the value of GDP, nominal, tends to be higher. Real GDP tends to be lower. And GDP, nominal GDP can be used to compare with various quarters of a given year. Let's say in 2019, you can compare the first quarter, suku pertama, with the second quarter, suku kedua, and third and fourth quarter, or suku keempat, and suku ketiga for that particular year. Real GDP you can compare between years. So you can compare 2019 and 2018 GDP. But when you use nominal, you cannot compare 2018 GDP and 2019 GDP. Right? So you have to use real. So in terms of economic growth, from nominal GDP, economic growth cannot be analyzed easily. Because it is only a simple figure. So you have to use a real GDP. A real GDP is a good indicator of economic growth. In order for you to determine the growth, then you have to compare it with the years before the year that you are looking at. If you are looking at 2019, you have to compare it with 2018, 2017, and before that. Only then you can see whether the growth has taken place or not in that particular economy.